Welcome to Wheelock's Latin, chapter 39. In this chapter, we're going to be looking at gerundives again, so this will be a bit of a review, but we'll also be looking at gerunds. So this is a new verbal noun that we'll be looking at. Let's do a quick review on gerundives. If you remember, back in chapter 23, we learned about participles, and participles are, of course, verbal adjectives. And one of those forms, the future passive participle that ended in nd, that was the infix nd plus the first and second declension endings us, were the endings for the future passive participles. So that is the gerundive. That's just another name for the future passive participle. And it had a sense of obligation, necessity, or propriety, sense of oughtness. So that's what a gerundive is. It's a verbal adjective, specifically the future passive participial form. Now, a gerund is very similar in many ways, but different in many ways. A gerund is a verbal, but it's not a verbal adjective. It's not a verb functioning as an adjective, as a participle does, but it is a verbal noun. So it is a verb that will function in place of a noun. It will have the same form as gerundives. In other words, it's the future passive participial form. It's ending in nd, us, so indus aum. However, here's what's different about gerunds. They will be translated as active rather than the expected passive. So while gerundives are passive, gerunds are active. There are only four forms of the gerund. They are the neuter singular forms, specifically genitive, dative, accusative, and ablative. There is no nominative because gerunds are never used as subjects, nor are they used as direct objects. Infinitives will be used. The verbal noun, the infinitive, will be used as a subject or direct object when needed, so that form will be used. There is an accusative form, but it's never used as a direct object. It will be used with the preposition odd or other certain other prepositions to indicate purpose. Now, if you remember, we've already learned how to use purpose, subjunctive clauses for purpose being introduced by ut. We've looked at the supine, the accusative supine used with verbs of motion to indicate purpose. And here we have another use or function of purpose using the accusative gerund with the preposition odd. A comparison between gerundives and gerunds. Now, as we said, both gerundives and gerunds are verbals, which means they have characteristics of both verbs and either nouns or adjectives. In this case, gerundives are verbal adjectives. Gerunds, however, are verbal nouns. Gerundives, as adjectives, will have the full complement of forms, masculine, feminine, neuter. All cases involve nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, ablative, and singular and plural. Gerunds will only have four forms. They will have the neuter singular forms in genitive, dative, accusative, and ablative. And then the gerundives will be translated as passive, which we would normally expect since they are the passive form. However, gerunds, even though they're the passive form, will be translated as active. So those are a comparison of gerundives and gerunds. Let's look at the clinching, I should say, of gerunds. We've got the paradigm verb laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatum, and the stem, of course, is lauda, and you have the nd infix, so laudand, and then you have the first and second declension endings in singular, starting with the genitive, o. So laudandi, of praising. So remember, it's a genitive, of praising. Laudando, to or for praising, dative. Accusative, laudandum, praising. And then laudando, by praising. There's your ablative. Here is a fourth declension, audeo, auderi, adewi, auditum. Audiendi, of hearing. Audiendo, to or for hearing. Audiendum, hearing, and audiendo, by hearing. So that's how you decline them out. And again, just the genitive, dative, accusative, and ablative singular forms. And it's in all conjugations, first, second, third, fourth, and third IO. Now here are some examples of gerunds in situ, or in place. Studium legendi libros habet. Here we've got our subject embedded with the verb, she or he has. from habao. She has studium, a zeal or a love. And here we have legendi. This is our gerund. It is in the genitive, so it's of reading. She has a zeal of reading or a love of reading libros, books. And books here is actually functioning as the object or the direct object of legendi. We'll look more at that in a minute. Here's another example, libros legendo discimus. Discimus, we learn. Present tense, first person plural. We learn legendo here is our ablative gerund by reading libros, books. We learn by reading books. And two more examples from Wheelock here. There we go. Studium vivendi cum amicis habet. Habet studium, she has a love. Vivendi from vivo, genitive here, of living. She has a love of living cum amicis, with friends. She has a love of living with friends. Now, you might want to change that to make it sound a little less wooden, a little bit more idiomatic here. Change that of to maybe for. She has a love for living with friends, or she has a zeal for living with friends. So vivendi is our genitive gerund. And here we've got ad bene vivendum Athenas it. He came, He came Athenas to Athens ad bene vivendum. Now remember, ad with the accusative shows purpose. So he came to Athens to live well, bene, to live well, or for the purpose of living well. That would be another way you could say that. So these are all examples of gerunds being used in place. Now, here's an interesting idiomatic usage of gerunds that is a little complicated, but stay with me here. Gerunds, as verbals, can take a direct object. We saw that a minute ago here with studium, legendi, libros, habet. Here we have your main verb, and studium is the direct object. She has, or he has, a zeal. That's our direct object, accusative here, singular, studium. And then we have legendi, which is our verbal, and it has its own direct object. Libros is the direct object of legendi. So we translate that as she has a zeal of reading books. Now, if you were to diagram this sentence out, here's what it would look like. Your subject, again, embedded with the verb, habet, studium is your direct object. And then you have the verbal phrase or verbal clause, legendi, and that's how you diagram gerunds, is on this little stair-stepped kind of platform, legendi, and then libros is functioning as the direct object of this verbal. Remember, it has gerunds are verbals, which means they have characteristics of verbs, and verbs can take direct objects. So that's what we mean here. Libros is the direct object of the quasi-verb legendi. So she has a zeal of reading books, or a love of reading books. All right. Now, again, gerunds can take direct objects as verbals, but here's something that's a little bit more complicated here. Stay with me here. Sometimes that direct object of the gerund will be drawn to or attracted to the gerund and will take on the case of that gerund, effectively making the gerund a gerundive, an adjective. And here's what that means, is that because now it's an adjective modifying its own direct object, its own object, it has to agree with that direct object in case, number, and gender. So it's got to change if need be. Generally, the number will need to be changed to accommodate. So let's see what this means. And here's the same sentence. Studium legendi libros habet. Again, habet and studium, main sentence. Legendi libros, we have legendi in the genitive as a gerund here. Libros is accusative plural, it's our direct object of legendi. All right, now we're going to take that same sentence, and here's what happens. Sometimes that direct object, like libros here, will be attracted to legendi here. It's gerund. And so what that means is it'll take on the case, whatever the case of that gerund is. In this case, legendi is genitive. So libros is going to become genitive. Now, genitive, as you can see, books is plural, so it's going to be genitive plural. And now the adjective legendi in the genitive has to become legendorum to take on the same form, in the Greek, I should say, case, number, gender, with libros. So here's what that looks like. Studium legendorum. It's become genitive plural because libros is plural, and libros shifted into the genitive case with the orum ending here, genitive plural, and so legendi had to take on the plural ending of orum as well. So studium, legendorum, librorum, habet, and both of these sentences are translated the exact same way. Let me drop that in there real quick. So now we have, again, verb and direct object, but now legendorum is essentially a verbal gerundive. It's our adjective modifying the direct object librorum. It's modifying its own direct object, all right? A verbal adjective modifying its own object. So the translation for both of these sentences is identically the same. She has a zeal or a love of reading books. So take your time to go back through this and see if that makes sense to you. If you have questions, we'll look at it in class. Don't forget to study vocabulary. We will have a quiz later this week.